Many thanks, Jorg, for bringing us really into the present and seeing that last image of this recent work, which I'd never seen before. It's just absolutely amazing. So thank you, and thank you also for your great text in the reader, which is in conjunction with the exhibition. So I'm going to just introduce us and segue us into the last panel of the day, and thank you all for still being here. But to continue kind of into the present, this last panel is called Voices in Dialogue, Fellow Global Travelers. And we'll have three guests here on stage. First, Elvan Zabunyan, critic, professor of a professor of art history at the University of Rennes, and also an author and our reader. Vid Simoniti, critic, fellow in art history at Cambridge University, and also an author and our reader. And Pablo Larios, who is a critic and senior editor of Frieze magazine. So I welcome you all up on stage, and thank you.
So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation, and many thanks to Claudia and all the public program team and also the technical team. Everything is really wonderfully organized, so it's very nice to be here. I would like to start by explaining my feelings about taking part in this panel titled Fellow Global Travelers and subtitled Europe-based critics who also have a migration background. It will also help to explain the orientation of my paper. I have decided that I should indeed focus first on my interpretation of what a migration background would mean in my case. I have hardly had the feeling of being of elsewhere, of having this double consciousness of different cultures, as my native land is France. At the time of my graduate studies in the 90s and in my first years of teaching, my academic research focused on the critical function of contemporary art, on center and margin issues, on the invisibility of some artistic practices, all questions which were then at the core of theoretical topicalities and paradigm shifts. My research centered on African American visual arts, and it was precisely in that context that I met Adrian Piper for the first time in 1993 in Paris. I was then working in a postgraduate art institute founded by famous curator Pontus Hulten and was finishing my master's degree. Adrian Piper had kindly accepted our invitation to give a lecture, and I had the chance and honor to spend several hours with her, through starting on an ongoing conversation about issues that are still relevant for my work today. A couple of years later, when I had just finished my PhD and was going to apply for an assistant professor position at the university, a male French art historian arrogantly told me, "You may have identity problems if you work on black artists." Or to put it differently, my work on black artists had to be understood to the light of an identity problem. I have to say that I was a little shocked at this racist remark, which I found, and still find, aggressive and completely inappropriate. 20 years later, I still think about what it means to have an interest in certain specific topics, and my cultural displacement as a concept, a reality, a geography, and a political involvement is so vividly embedded in my research, my writings, my teaching. Why are those issues so important for me, not as a private, personal, intimate questions that could trouble my identity, but as an intellectual necessity, an engagement with cultural and political objects that are part of an ethical position with which to face the world, to face discrimination of all kinds, to face injustice. I always, I have always felt a bit out of a limb when people at symposiums or events taking place in non-Western countries would address my interest in certain topics, claiming that I was speaking from the center, from Paris, a cultural capital where I was born, raised, and educated, and that my position could not represent with enough consideration the position of colleagues working in parts of the world where they were facing daily struggles to impose and affirm their knowledge. I remember having been especially affected by these comments when I was giving a series of seminars in Yerevan, Armenia, in a curatorial program attended by art critics and curators from Eastern countries. I felt troubled not because I felt alien, after all, I am of Armenian descent, but because I had the impression that even though born in a country like France, the consciousness of difference you carry with you makes you aware of the impossibility to proceed in the world as a dominant human being. It gives you a sense of relationship based on the fragility of life, and at the same time, this fragility carries strengths. It is a balance between Adrian Piper's statement, everything will be taken away, and we may be able to stabilize the moving ground migration can carry with it by working hard on political, emotional, political issues at once. My family is part Armenian from Istanbul, and of course I have a specific experience of being from abroad, but the feeling I carry with me is more a transgenerational diaspora feeling. This has certainly given me a base for my research as a scholar, working on a connected and global art history, on cultural transits, on the way artists and art practices are dealing with entangled subjectivities. I was recently reading the unfinished autobiography of Stuart Hall, Familiar Stranger, and I noted this sentence, quote, I've never been persuaded by the orthodox social science division between the objective and the subjective. It's always seemed to me that even the most abstract theories are, to varying degrees, informed by the subjective conditions of existence. That is, by the inner psychic dynamics of the theorist. I felt this to be true of my own life, and this book stands as an experiment in drawing out what connections I can between my life and my ideas, insofar as these are ever separable. Much of my professional life, writes Hall, has been concerned with the politics of who we think we are. I've been riveted by the question of how we can understand the chaos of identifications that we assembled in order to navigate the social world, and also how we seek to reach somehow ourselves. Of course, this arrival never occurs. We'll never be ourselves, whatever that could mean. Identity in the singular is never achieved with any finality. Identities in the plural are the means for becoming. I'll attempt to show how I think, where I am from. This is inseparably a historical and a conceptual issue. End quote. In Adrian Piper's work, we recognize the same oscillation between subjectivity and objectivity, but also between a historical and a conceptual issue. As the artist told writer Diana Stoll in a 2002 interview in Aperture, quote, what I have experienced is that my subjective sense of identity is much more expanded than I thought initially. I realize that there is an analogy between what happens with respect to different languages and different situations, with respect to my two different professions, with respect to the person I am on the mat and the person I am off the mat, I am really starting to think that the very concept of an individual ego is one that needs to be rethought. And this actually fits very nicely into yoga and Vedanta philosophy. End quote. I was always intrigued with this work, Ur Mutter, which Adrian Piper produced. There's several of it, but which Adrian Piper started to produce in 1989, and here with the inscription, "We made you." Every criticism of the hegemonic Western politics toward Africa is present here, but it also raises the question of a genealogy. Urmutter, the first mother, the founding figure, the one who represents where we come from. This title in German makes the link with the language of philosophy Adrian Piper is so familiar with. While searching for who the Urmutter represented and still represents, I have found two references. One is the woman who lived thousands of years ago and was discovered by archaeologists in South Africa, the woman who may be the trace of the first woman on Earth. The other is the reference to Hagar, the biblical figure who is the mother of Ismail and the embodiment of an African woman. While looking for a representation of Hagar, I found one that immediately caught my attention, a reproduction of Edmonia Lewis' sculpture. As Kirsten Pugh recalls in her 1995 article, the ideal works of titled "The Ideal Works of Edmonia Lewis: Invoking and Inverting Autobiography," quote, "Hagar, the Egyptian bondwoman to Sarah and Abraham, appears twice in the Old Testament and once in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, Sarah, who is barren, sanctions the impregnation of Hagar by Abraham. Ultimately, Hagar and her son, Ismail, are sent away to wander in the wilderness. Because Egypt was coded as Black Africa among abolitionists and colonialists in the 19th century, Hagar was a particularly pertinent allegory of chattel slavery and the indignities that Black women suffered. Lewis's treatment of the subject skillfully manages to allude to each appearance of Hagar in the Bible." End quote. Even though I did not study her work in depth, I was always interested in Edmonia Lewis's unconventional life, as she decided not to conform to existing gender ideals. She refused marriage, she decided to sculpt, and went against Victorian conventions. Furthermore, I was also interested in these neoclassical marble statues she produced. But I did not have biographical details and learned quite late, for example, that she left the United States in order to move to Italy, where she spent part of her life and realized some of her important body of work. For example, the famous Forever Free, which was sculpted in 1867 when she was in Rome, and it became a strong symbol in the context of abolition. I liked the coincidence that she was an American artist who traveled to Europe and who thought, in a way, had this experience of migration. I will not develop here the literature which exists on this sculpture through the prism of race and gender. For the latter, the question lies in the reproduction of stereotypical patriarchal domination, which the standing man having his hand on the shoulder of the woman on her knees. I am more interested here in the use of the marble, the reversed binary of the colors white and black, the possibility of not being the literal representation of a black figure with a black medium, but the creation of an interesting slippage between the fine arts techniques and marble as a noble material to represent the figure of the slaves in a victorious posture. I was also interested in introducing here the figure of the slave to compare with Adrian Piper's own genealogy, which is in the show. And everything, number 17, which is also in the show. What we gain and what we lose, and what we gain through loss, is the basis of the diagrams, everything number 17.2 and everything number 17.3, which I will present a little later. The starting point of this diagram, time, advances in fits and starts, alternating between gain and loss, enslavement and liberation. Like the conceptual graphs that she made in the late 1960s, these works reveal the complementary aspects of randomness and structure, repetition and alternation. The phrase, everything will be taken away, is the threshold of the experiment. At the heart of this paradox lies all the ways we weave relationships with systemic structures of power and the choices that allow us to be free of them. These passages from black to white and vice versa as a conceptual matter that we have in the graphs are especially rendered in black box, white box, which is an installation I have studied again and again over many years, as it is for me a pivotal moment of her practice, in her practice, an important moment also because it is there that she is including the statement, everything will be taken away for the first time. Black box, white box presents a contrast. It's two geometric forms generating a dual space. The identical cubes, one white, one black, are minimalist and neutral on the outside. But on the inside, they function as repositories for the experience of a grief and anger in response to world events. The installation was first presented at the Wexner Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, in the 1992 exhibition Will/Power. It opened in September, 5 months after the burning of Los Angeles, where riots followed the announcement of a verdict of innocence for the 4 officers charged with King's beating. Piper painting the walls gray to recall the smoke in the streets, the sounds of the sirens filled the space. In the white cube, Marvin Gaye's 1971 What's Going On played on repeat, an accompaniment to George Holiday's amateur video showing King's being beaten. In the black cube, a portrait of King with a swollen face hangs across from an image of President Bush shaking hands with the acquitted police officers. Mother, mother, there's too many of you crying. Brother, 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 there's far too many of you dying. You know we've got to find a way to bring some loving here today. Gaye sings in his classic song. 20 years later, in another place, Rodney King says, quote, I just want to say, you know, can we all get along? Can we get along? Can we stop making it horrible for the older people and for the kids? We got enough smoke here in Los Angeles, let alone setting these fires. It's just not right. It's not right, end quote. One of the reasons why I consider this work so important is also linked to its topicality. It seems, unfortunately, that the political reasons for this recurrent violence is due to the various kinds of discrimination that are still part of current events. At the entrance for the 2 cubes, viewers can read the following quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, The First Circle, published in 1968. Once you have taken everything away from a man, he is no longer in your power. He is free. The experience of imprisonment that Solzhenitsyn describes is simultaneously one of violence and of spiritual self-fulfillment. At the heart of this dichotomy, we found a philosophical position that Piper had defended with her phrase, "Everything will be taken away," a thread guiding her work since 2003, and which the practice of yoga and Vedanta have given her the tools to consider. Think about it, tells us that Adrian Piper has been informing us for years of the necessity to face our responsibilities as citizens of the world. During the decade following the black box, white box installation, Adrian Piper focused on an in-depth spiritual search, inserting major references to Indian philosophy in both her theoretical and artistic practice. It was in this context that Piper produced her first work in the Everything series, which marks both a rupture with and a continuation of the work she made in the previous decades, reinforcing the process through which the practice of art making and thought making are fused. Everything number 2 is a small sheet of graph paper with the phrase "everything will be taken away" typed across its center. Everything number 2 places in the foreground the contrast between construction, the graph paper's allusion to three-dimensional spaces and erasure, the disappeared image. The work is dated April 28, 2003. The war, 1 month in, was already devastating Iraq. Everything will be taken away, which Piper has since used as a leitmotif, is therefore linked to the war and to what she considers as an irreversible political shift, one that ushered in an era where, in the United States, anyone with a conscience could no longer be at peace with him or herself. Here, Piper persevered in her careful analysis of history and politics, adjusting her spatial and visual proposals to meet the immediate relevance of her research. Piper's spiritual wisdom, as well as the unrelenting rigor of a critical method, set the color wheel series within a specific transitional moment, a moment when the full meets the empty, a moment when she proposes spaces of materiality and non-materiality engage and intertwine, and when personal and political involvement meet. I said above that I would mention this second diagram, which is organized around changes in states, liquefaction, condensation, evaporation, wherein heat circulates from one environment to another. Vanishing in the air, becoming air, disappearing, fading in invisibility, but always being aware of where we are speaking from and to whom we are speaking. When I was first browsing through her travel memoir, Escape to Berlin, I found it interesting that the first "everything will be taken away" was within the pages of a section I did not know titled Homeless, and which is from the same year, 2002, as the Color Wheel series. But this homeless feeling is similar to the one you experience when you migrate or when you find yourself in the middle of a natural catastrophe, like a hurricane. This horrific moment in the southern states of the country corresponds exactly to the moment when she left the US. She narrates it in her travel memoir, quote, "I carried those worries throughout the trip in silence and celebrated mentally the true meaning of my arrival in Berlin. We touched down in Tegel Airport just as the Hurricane Katrina was hitting the Gulf Coast of the United States. I did not look back at my Cape Cod house until almost 2 years later, when I opened the photos I had taken during my last days there. Then I cried myself voiceless, as having to give up the spacious, light-filled, airy sanctuary I had created, the sanctuary I had been unable to fortify strongly enough to protect me. This piece is the result I produced in 2007 after I had gotten settled in Berlin. It is called Everything number 9.1. It consists of 9 inkjet prints mounted onto a wall at a location determined by the hand-drawn blue line grid in which they are placed. 4 of the prints are scenes of devastation from Hurricane Katrina, overprinted with the text. If your eye moves around these 4, they form a cross. End of quote. Fleeing a country at war, leaving the place where you live, going through the experience of departure for political, economical, ethical or cultural reasons is a reality faced by hundreds of thousands of people in the world. Everyone can ask themselves these questions in relation to their own lives. Have you remained in the place you were born? Could you have stayed? Why did you leave? How were you able to leave? Will you return? What enables you to live wherever you are? Referring again to what Stuart Hall is emphasizing, we can come back to this idea of awareness of the place where we find ourselves, the way in which we live in this place with our memories and our experience of displacement. You can even question the here and the elsewhere from the point where you are, from the point you resolve around. How are you defined by your origin as well as the memory of the place where you were born, when you must, at the same time, insistently justify the point of departure, just when you arrive somewhere? The chapter of Eve Ensler's book says, in the name of security, they somehow forgot to protect people. I would conclude this paper with 2 works of Adrian Piper, which are for me the very relevant in their synthesis of both historicity and topicality and their link to violence. I am interested in the contrast between mute and vanishing images and the mental sound of a blast that is conveyed by those images. Everything number 6 of 2004 presents 6 faded portraits of murdered American political figures: Abraham Lincoln, Medgar Evers, J.F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, in the order of their assassinations from 1865 to 1968. The phrase, "everything will be taken away," has the impact of a bullet to the head. The image contains the sound of a gun discharging. It makes the history of American violence resonate in a continuum. Piper marks this continuum once more in her 2013 portrait, Imagine Trayvon Martin, made in memory of Martin and the appalling circumstances of his death, a tragic reminder of the historical determinism of which Rodney King was also a victim. Printed on the evanescent face of the teenager is a red target. And if you are being attentive, you recognize that the target is exactly the same as the one in the Color Wheels series. There is this permanence in Adrian Piper's work, a permanence which is, for me, representative of an ever alert and unquiet position toward the present world. And I have to finish. I'm sorry I was a little bit longer, but there's the music for 2 minutes. Thank you.
A poem for Jose Campos Torres. I had said I wasn't going to write no more poems like this. I had confessed to myself all along, tracer of life, poetry, trends, that awareness, consciousness poems that screamed of pain and the origins of pain and death had blanketed my tablets, and therefore my friends, brothers, sisters, in-laws, outlaws, and besides, they already knew. But Brother Torres, common ancient bloodline Brother Torres, is dead. I had said I wasn't going to write no more poems like this. I had said I wasn't going to write no more words down about people kicking us when we're down, about racist dogs that attack us and drive us down, drag us down and beat us down. But the dogs are in the street. The dogs are alive, and the terror in our hearts has scarcely diminished. It has scarcely brought us the comfort we suspected. The recognition of our terror and the screaming release of that recognition has not removed the certainty of that knowledge. How could it? The dogs, rabid, foaming with the energy of their brutish ignorance, stride the city streets like robot gunslingers and spread death as night lamps flash crude reflections from gun butts and police shields. I had said I wasn't going to write no more poems like this, but the battlefield has oozed away from the stilted debates of semantics, beyond the questionable flexibility of primal screaming. The reality of our city, jungle streets, and their Gestapos has become an attack on home, life, family, philosophy, total. It is beyond the question of the advantages of didactic niggerisms. The motherfucking dogs are in the street. In Houston, maybe someone said Mexicans were the new niggas. In LA, maybe someone said Chicanos were the new niggas. In Frisco, maybe someone said Orientals were the new niggas. Maybe in Philadelphia and North Carolina, they decided they didn't need no new niggas. I had said I wasn't gonna write no more poems like this, but the dogs are in the street. It's a turnaround world where things are all too quickly turned around. It was turned around so that right looked wrong. It was turned around so that up looked down. It was turned around so that those who marched in the street with Bibles and signs of peace became enemies of the state and risk to national security, so that those who questioned the operations of those in authority on the principles of justice, liberty, and equality became the vanguard of a communist attack. It became so you couldn't call a spade a motherfucking spade. Brother Torres is dead. The Wilmington 10 are still incarcerated. Ed Davis, Ronald Reagan, James Hunt, and Frank Rizzo are still alive, and the dogs are in the motherfucking street. I had said I wasn't gonna write no more poems like this. I made a mistake.
Wow, it's quite something to come on after that joint image of Piper and Gil Scott Heron. I guess in the presence of great art, words can fail us, but we have to press on, so there we go. So I'm going to talk about Piper in the context of a recent exhibition, and this exhibition is the Berlin Biennial 2016. So the Berlin Biennial 2016 was an exhilarating affair curated by the Disc Collective from New York. The exhibition was intended to mirror the mad kaleidoscopic nature of our online experience. I say kaleidoscopic in the sense that every click on line that we make draws us into new experiences, one after another, all potentially entertaining, but all potentially superficial and empty. As Babak Radboy, one of the participating artists, remarked, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, quote, "We are making art fun again. Make art fun again. There is nothing to worry about, no critique, no discourse, no stakes," end of quote. And if you're thinking 2016, make something again, you can see how this could be a bit ironic. But at any rate, the biennial sought to exemplify and perhaps parody our frivolous digital lives, the taking of selfies or creation of Instagram profiles. And in this context, the works of Adrian Piper came as rather somber elements. So one work was a projection of the no entry traffic sign. I should say these works were made for other contexts, but here they are in this biennial. So one of them was this projection of the no entry traffic sign combined with the informal American greeting howdy, which Piper had showed on several closed doors and that you can see in this exhibition at the Hammer as well. So the greeting here is friendly, but chillingly so. Howdy, stop. This is where the fun ends, pal. Sorry, this is how I imagine Americans use this howdy. Anyway, but what it seems to be saying in the context of this exhibition is that there are certain institutional and structural powers greater than yourself than as you're roaming through this exhibition or you're perhaps roaming through online space suddenly appear and put an end to your explorations. There are powers that determine how far we can go. Another work had a similarly chilling and interruptive quality. So this is from Piper's Everything series that Elvan talked about as well. So here in this instantiation, we have a simple mirror with the words, "Everything will be taken away," engraved with gold leaf text onto the surface. The effect, of course, is that we end up looking into our own eyes, that we see ourselves with these words superimposed over our own face. And the work would say, I think, again, to the visitor of the biennial, that all of this fun, all of this transitory experience will be eventually taken away from you. And I felt slightly similar yesterday at the opening party of this exhibition, where everyone was dancing and having fun, and suddenly you see a person carrying this sign, "Everything will be taken away," right? It has a similar effect. So I think that including these works in the biennial was really quite a brilliant move by the curators. I mean, many people didn't like the biennial, they felt it was too frivolous, but I think at least these works kind of said something interesting about the overall jouissance of our digital lives. They kind of shattered these two illusions that seem to permeate or that underwrite our experience of lives online: the illusion of freedom and the kind of illusion of immortality. So, okay, so these reflections aside, we all know Adrian Piper's work pretty well by now, and I think it comes as no surprise to say that her works aren't exactly easygoing, frothy fun, even though they're not, of course, without their humor. They're almost always characterized instead by a kind of thrilling intellectual danger. There is a sense with her works that if we follow them to their logical conclusion, we are going to come up against something necessary, but something potentially very uncomfortable, and yet we cannot but follow them to their conclusion. And more specifically, I think the tension in her works derives both from occasioning moments of introspection, so reflecting on your own particular mental state at this moment, as in this case, where you're reflecting on yourself, literally, in the mirror, either that kind of moment of introspection or a moment of confrontation and dialogue. Here, something else, something other than yourself is stopping you, is greeting you, and potentially barring you from entering somewhere. So these twin topics, introspection and confrontational conversation, are going to be the topics I'm going to investigate by looking at three exemplars: some of Piper's early conceptual work, her work in philosophy, and her anti-racist installation works. So to begin with, let us go back in time a little bit and consider this work, the Philip Zong catalysis from 1972. Around this year, Piper was making semi-private performance pieces like the other catalysis series pieces that Nizam talked about, which, as she told us, and as we've seen other speakers elaborate on, were sometimes performed in these kind of semi-private environments with no other audience present. So in this case, what Piper did is she recorded her side of a telephone conversation with her friend Philip Zahn. So she had a conversation with him, she recorded it, taped it, and then memorized that her part of the conversation and repeated it in various situations, sometimes in the solitude of her loft, sometimes in front of a shop window on a street, at the time of sunrise, and so on. So Philip Zahn, like Piper, was a graduate student in philosophy, and the conversation, the transcript of which is also in her Out of Order, Out of Sight book, flowed freely from philosophical topics covering passion, will, truth, to science fiction, to what happens when a dog tries to fuck your knee. So Piper memorized all of this and recited it. So what does it mean to do a work like that? So the piece, firstly, I think, elaborates on the introspective aspect of conceptual art, that sense that art for first-generation conceptualists like Sol LeWitt begins and perhaps ends with the idea purely existing in the artist's head, which is first and foremost accessible to the artist by concentrating on or marveling at that internal state, right? supposedly anyway, the work is not the trace on the wall, but the idea in Lewitt's head. And the idea then transferred into the audience's head, or the audience can then also access through their own introspection. So there's something kind of slightly self-centered, perhaps solipsistic about that early conceptual art. The real action is inside the mind and potentially not accessible. But in the Philip Zone catalysis, this theme of solipsism, this idea, gets a particularly kind of melancholy overtone. The artist is repeatedly reciting only her side of the telephone conversation, as if reaching out to her friend, but never being quite able to recover his side of the conversation. And the piece acquires even more poignant overtone in the knowledge that 10 years later, Piper lost her friend to AIDS. However, as well as evoking introspection and solipsism, so this idea that I might be, that my own conscious thoughts might be the only things that exist, as well as that, the piece is of course also about the opposite, about conversation, about the exhilarating thrill of exploring an abstract space with another mind, with a friend, in this free-flowing way. As many of us, I think back to our days at the university, as the speakers in the first panel have done with regards to Piper, I think that what has made it all worthwhile, or school or graduate school, whatever it might be, is not probably all the dry essays that we might have written, nor the knowledge that we might have imbibed, but precisely those kinds of conversations, those rare but precious moments when you find someone with whom you can explore this completely abstract space with. Okay, so my first point is that in works like Philip Zone, human beings are shown to be creatures that are both self-focused and dialogical. And there's a kind of a tension there. And by extension, we might say that conceptual art in this early stage has been motivated by both of these themes, introspection and conversation. Now, if all this strikes you as somewhat philosophical and abstract, you would of course be correct. For a philosophical temperament depends precisely on these two dispositions. So introspection in the sense that if I am marveling at my own internal states, what makes me me, what secures the continuity with my dreams this morning and the conscious experience I'm having now, right? Introspection leads to these foundational philosophical questions about persistence of identity over time, for example. And dialogue, on the other hand, leads to philosophical questions like, how do I know other people have minds? How do I settle philosophical disputes with them? And so on. So now I'll try to connect these concerns with Piper's engagement with the philosopher Immanuel Kant, which of course is central to her work. This work has already been talked about today. And to do so, I need to give a very quick summary of Kant's main points, because I don't want to presuppose any knowledge of this. Now, attempting to give a quick summary of Kant's main points is kind of a ridiculous thing for anyone to attempt. And moreover, I'm going to be talking about Piper's own interpretation of Kant. So there are many mistakes that I can potentially make, and I apologize in advance for if I botch things or make a mess of Kant. Okay, so let's start here. So Kant's great contributions to philosophy, I think it's not too wrong to say, are all rooted in one way or another in his philosophy of mind. So for Kant, there is crucially no innocent eye. We never simply perceive the world as it is. So we never simply perceive the world as an amorphous blob of sensations. Instead, my concepts, the conceptual schema that I have, always already structures the experience that I have. So to give a kind of a toy example, if I look into my garden, I never just see like some amorphous blob of data and then I kind of theorize what that might be. My experience is already structured with the previous conceptual schema of a cat that I have. So I already see, lovely snuggles there hidden behind the tree. So thoughts without contents are empty, as the famous quote goes, intuitions without concepts are blind. So that is to say, intuitions, or what we would nowadays call perhaps sense data or raw perceptual inputs, we don't tend to have access to that, right? That's always only, to see is to see through a particular conceptual schema. And Kant distinguishes between empirical categories such as cat or podium or a lecturer, so these kind of things that we acquire, that we learn, and the transcendental categories that are universal to all humanity, so space, time, causality, substance, and so on. These are the foundations for all human reasoning. So, okay, so nowadays that is kind of the acceptable starting point for our almost folk psychology about how we perceive things. Our perception is theory-laden in some sense, we might say, but the implications for Kant's thought go much further than that, go far beyond perception. Because by attending to these mechanics of our mind, by finding these categories which structure my perception, I am finding the underlying principles of rationality which unite me with all other human beings. Right, so this is kind of Kant's transcendental deduction. We needn't go into that. But the point is that that rationality, that structure of thinking, is what then provides the key for both Kant's metaphysics and philosophy of science, so how it is that science has objective validity for all human beings, because we all operate through time, space, and so on. His ethics, his practical reason, and also, of course, his experience of beauty in the third critique. So far, probably so familiar. Now, Piper's magnum opus in philosophy, her Rationality and the Structure of the Self, which is over 1,000 pages long and which came out in 2015, is both an interpretation of Kant, but it is also Schopenhauer's interpretation of Kant or Hannah Arendt's, I think, a kind of an upgrade. So I hope Adrian doesn't sort of tell me off for getting things wrong, but the way I read it is that Piper's main kind of interpretive thrust is to say that what the Kantian view of rationality comes down to is that the self that is doing the thinking, is structured as a transpersonal entity. So this is what she calls the transpersonal conception of the self. So to be a thinking self, on Piper's view, is to have certain dispositions like consistency, coherence, self-reflection, and self-control. This is what enables even basic reasoning, right? So my disposition towards coherence allows me to make my experience in the garden cohere with my previous experience of cats and so on. But what's really important is that to be motivated by things like coherence is to be already capable of also taking on the perspectives of others. So if you say, no, that's not a cat, that's a little baby seal, I mean, that would be a bizarre thing to say, but to have this transpersonal self means that I'm already capable of thinking through your perspective as well and thinking whether or not it matches mine and so on. And crucially, that activity is capable of motivating us, right? It's something that I'm able to act upon. It's something that makes me excited and makes me want to incorporate your experience into mine. So as a vivid picture of that kind of motivation, we might think back to the Philip zone catalysis, where what unites two minds in an ongoing conversation is not to advance some personal interest, but precisely to explore the intellectual space with another person and to see whether their picture of reality coheres with mine. Right? So you're kind of trying to see, oh, it's really interesting that this person is thinking about these matters slightly differently. Let's see how this comes together, right? And this is kind of driving, this is motivating the conversation. And I think that that is perhaps a good example of what a transpersonal conception of the self looks like. Indeed, Piper's second volume of her book is precisely dedicated to her friend Philip Zon. So I would argue that Piper's philosophical picture is highly optimistic. Indeed, she contrasts it with the accepted Humean or egocentric view of the self in philosophy, for which rational creatures are motivated primarily by their beliefs and desires. So they're not primarily interested in incorporating other people's views with their own, but advancing their own desires with their instrumental rationality. By contrast, for Piper, rational creatures are already transpersonal or dialogic or capable or willing to incorporate other people's perspective into their own. Okay, so what is familiar, I think, to many of us is that Piper's work is, of course, heavily influenced by Kant, not just her philosophy, but also her art. So, for example, well, of course, the Hammer retrospective is called Concepts and Intuitions, which I introduced here. And we may detect this theme of concepts and intuitions in such famous works as her self-portrait, Exaggerating My Negroid Features from 1981. So here, Kantian philosophy, or this duality of concepts of intuitions, helps us make sense of the xenophobic gaze, where the racialized fiction, the racialized concept, or the stereotype of a black person is here depicted as structuring Piper's or the artist's self-representation on the paper. Now, it's interesting as well, I think, that like a lot of Piper's work from this period, from the 70s and 80s, is happening at around the same time as in cognitive psychology and in social psychology. People are starting really to talk about these things that we today are so familiar with. So things like implicit bias and cognitive penetration of subtle racism and post-civil rights era racism in American society, which has certain similarities with the Kantian idea of cognitive penetration. Okay, so on a Kantian view, we can make sense of this idea of perception as theory-laden or encumbered with concepts, and this helps us make sense of stereotyping. However, this does not yet satisfactorily explain the connection between Piper's art and Piper's philosophy. After all, one does not need to be a Kantian in order to notice or to talk about stereotypes or to talk about cognitive penetration of our perception. Indeed, given Piper's attention to xenophobia and racism, it is perhaps surprising that she is a Kantian. So aside from Kant's own, sometimes racist views documented in various writings, any faith in enlightened rationalism is belied by sheer scale of organized murder and xenophobia, which has been perpetrated precisely in the name of rationality and the Enlightenment. I mean, that is not to make a kind of a facile causal mistake of saying, Kant caused all of these murders. I mean, I think that would clearly be a wrong thing to say. But it does mean that if we are aware of the ways in which Europe has perpetrated all of these crimes in the name of reason and rationality, it seems that we would be naturally much more drawn towards a kind of an egocentric or kind of more pessimistic conception of the self, right? The pessimistic conception of the self, which says that we are primarily driven by our selfish desires and by the desire to dominate, makes much more sense for making sense in the way in which reason has been abused to justify such global domination and global injustices. So shouldn't we be kind of pessimist about human ability to employ reason to incorporate other perspectives rather than optimist? And shouldn't we make sense of rational discourse as yet another power grab, as thinkers from Nietzsche to Freud to Foucault and others have so influentially done? So, why is Piper not some kind of a postmodernist or post-structuralist? Okay, so now optimism and pessimism about human nature, that fork in the road is clearly somewhat artificially set up here, and we don't have to make that choice so explicitly. However, if I'm putting things a bit too schematically here, it's because I do want to draw an attention to what I find to be especially curious and original about Piper's study of Kant. And that is that unusually for a Kantian, Piper spends a long time looking long and hard at those abuses of reason, such as biased perceptions, xenophobic exclusions, and other ways of banding rationality to our drive to power. Indeed, half of her second volume, Rationality and the Structure of the Self, is dedicated precisely to that. So she terms such forms of bias pseudo-rationality and maintains, perhaps surprisingly, that pseudo-rationality has the same root cause as proper transpersonal rationality. So xenophobic pseudo-rationality, or bias or racism, is also an expression of the dispositions towards coherence, consistency, and so forth. Both then our ethical natures, both that which enables us to incorporate other people's perspective, and our racism and our xenophobia are shown to be fruits of the same tree, of the same root. So how? So for Piper, xenophobia occurs when people, But for Piper, xenophobia occurs when we fail to make sense of people in their complexity and instead impose certain simplifying stereotypes upon them. However, this is, of course, just a more special case of the way that human reasoning works in general. Even with the kind of simple cat examples, in order to reason at all, we always have to make shortcuts. We always have to make sense of complexity in terms of something more simple, in terms of something more stereotypical. Okay, so there are two interesting consequences of this. Firstly, what motivates these forms of xenophobia is not sort of just simplistically kind of evil or violence, against human nature, or some unreasonable desire not wanting to cooperate, or a kind of an unreasonable power struggle. The racist, and here I am interpreting Piper, the racist is also trying to make sense of her experiences and her world. Piper writes, quote, "Pseudo-rationality is the expression of our attempt to save face before our humiliating intellective defeat at the hands of the real," end quote. So xenophobia of some kind is then just as universal as human reasoning in general. It is a tragic but necessary consequence of our attempts to find coherence and consistency in our world. This is why I think that in her anti-racist art, Piper is so insistent that xenophobia is widely present and can be found in anybody. That's why I think she's so insistent in analyzing the seemingly benign, well-intentioned consciousness of the gallery goer in works such as The Four Intruders or aspects of The Liberal Dilemma. And I think this is also why Piper is so insistent in many of her works that we all be constantly on our guard, constantly ready to self-examine the shortcuts that our minds make, because this kind of xenophobia is a universal feature of human rationality. Okay, but the second interesting consequence is that within Piper's philosophy, the only solution to these pseudo-rational forms of thinking cannot be less reason or retreat from reason, but only more reason. Now, that's not to say that reason is some sort of syrup that we can kind of add a little bit of and then we get xenophobia, and we add a lot of and then we kind of transcend it, but rather than in the Kantian framework with which she works, the only way to deal with this is to unremittingly and constantly insist on patient introspection of one's biases and confront people in a reasoned dialogue. Now, I think it's often noted how effective Piper's anti-racist works are, but I think it's less often noted that they actually do give a voice to the racist consciousness. And in fact, they foreground the racist consciousness quite prominently, in the hope, in making the wager, that the audience's own ability to strive towards coherence, own ability to investigate what exactly has gone wrong there, is going to lead them to conclusions and to insights as to what can also amount to racism. Or to put it in a different way, I think this is why, I think this Kantian framework that I tried to elaborate briefly explains why Piper, in her work, has never resorted to that kind of ironic complicity, which is such a favorite strategy among many celebrated American artists, from Andy Warhol to Cindy Sherman to perhaps Kara Walker, right? So in none of her works does she do something that was very familiar to people in the art world of that time, which is to kind of jokingly play along with some form of oppression or injustice. It's always this commitment to argument and self-examination that is the route towards emancipation, and I think that that commitment to Kantian transpersonal rationality, which Piper develops in her philosophical work, then helps to make sense of her artistic work as well. Now, just super briefly, I think if we think about Piper's work in the context of contemporary art and her place within art today, we needn't say that all art should be like this, that there isn't a place for playing along or for irony or perhaps even willful complicity. But I think that Piper's commitment to conversation in art is highly instructive. After all, our biennial-based art today is nothing but a protracted conversation on important social themes, from global warming to the refugee crisis. And so the main criterion for success in such discursive art must be whether or not such work succeeds in engaging us in an intelligent conversation. And I think in that, Piper's work can surely be a paragon to follow. Thanks.
Hello. Just like to say thank you, first off, for the invitation, and secondly, for the interesting conversations today, and thirdly, for the audience's patience and hearing everyone out. I guess just to go off script for a little bit, something that came to mind when I was thinking about Adrian Piper's work and listening to the other speakers was the extent to which the work navigates certain questions of specialization or expertise and other questions of sort of privileged knowledge. So I was aware, I'm aware of the fact that I think I'm the only speaker here who actually doesn't know Adrian Piper personally. So I'm, in a certain way, I don't have that sort of privileged knowledge. I'm also not an art historian or an academic, and I'm also not an analytic philosopher. So I guess there's two reasons that I bring that up. One is the extent to which Piper's work is sort of dependent on any kinds of any sort of versions of expertise in any of these fields. And the second question is the extent to which it itself navigates or requires a sort of, let's say, holistic understanding of all of those fields. And something else that hasn't come up is her dedication, of course, to the practice of yoga. So I just bring this up also because I think it's important to consider Piper's work in its attention to rigor and its attention to, again, the different kinds of specialization that inform it. But as a kind of counter-argument or a kind of challenge to that, I also think it's important to maybe have in mind, the certain kinds of art making that I would call a kind of hedging. So when does the work sort of navigate these different forms of specialization productively, and when does it kind of hedge between them? And I think it's important because in my life as an art critic, I do come across certain kinds of work that in which forms of specialization are actually instrumentalized in a way in which the art needs to kind of have a certain kind of expertise as its crutch. So I think what the different speakers today have shown is that there's not a kind of single conclusive way in which Piper's philosophical work relates to her conceptual artistic work, but they are related. So something else that I'd like to just kind of preface my talk with is what's at stake in thinking through Piper's work without the kind of information or privileged information of specialized expertise, but just as a kind of informed and curious viewer, such as might experience the exhibition here. So I'd like to talk today about Adrian Piper's piece, The Probable Trust Registry, The Rules of the Game, numbers 1 to 3. Piper's work is a philosophical proposition in social contract theory and metaethics, but it articulates this proposition not through argument, but by a game theoretical construct, namely a work of participatory performance art. A live game involving written contracts, members of the public, and the archival memory of a database system. Before examining the piece, I'd like to turn to a legal case which is under review now by the US Supreme Court in the term that began just a few days ago, the case of Madison versus Alabama. Given the fraught and distressing situation surrounding the confirmation of a new Supreme Court justice yesterday, such a case is easy to overlook, but its implications are revealing. The concepts invoked by this legal case shed some light, I think, about some similar concepts put forward by Piper in her own works. Madison versus Alabama concerns an Alabama death row inmate named Vernon Madison. He was found guilty of killing a police officer in 1985. Madison's first 2 trials were each dismissed. In one, the trial was dismissed because it was found that black people were excluded from the jury. And the other, the evidence was found to have been tampered with. Madison was tried a 3rd time and sentenced to death. Years later, Madison now is found to have severe dementia due to a medical condition and cannot remember the crime he committed, though he can understand that he will be executed. So at the time that he committed the alleged crime, he didn't have dementia, now he does. Due to the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment, there's a question as to whether the state can legally execute Madison, since he has no memory of his crime. Madison's degenerative medical condition prevents him from remembering the crime for which he was convicted or understanding the circumstances of his scheduled execution. Justice Sandra Sotomayor, in her argument to overturn the sentence, said that Madison is, quote, just not rational in the way that you and I understand. Clearly, the facts of this real-life situation involving someone's life and the precedent the ruling will set on the lives of others are legally complex and morally compelling. In 1986, the US Supreme Court barred the execution of inmates who were deemed mentally incompetent, though the ban on the prosecution of the insane has a long historical precedent. There's many reasons for this, but presumably the insane cannot defend themselves or present evidence, and also they cannot equate deed with retribution. My point in bringing up this case is not to debate it or the dubious legitimacy of capital punishment in the US, but to point out some of the legal concepts on which it rests. The first such concept is the legal subject's own memory. Memory means the capacity to understand and reproduce information, the capacity for the human mind to archive and recall. What does this capacity have to do with justice? Something, apparently, as it's argued now that the state has no legal basis on which to punish someone who is unable to correlate past apperceptions. The second concept is cognitive. The prisoner is required to understand what his execution means, that his life will end and why. Without both of these prerequisites, from a judicial standpoint, the punishment serves no legal function as either deterrent or retribution. So, 2 legal functions: to deter future crimes and to retribute the individual who caused one of them, or to cause a crime. So, in this case, the law itself is suspended. Is it possible that the judges are invoking a central tenet of Enlightenment reasoning? Yes. As Sotomayor implies, the law has no basis to punish an actor who acts not rationally or freely. As the justices have noted, the role of precedent in the case is at stake, and that precedent follows a structure of exemplarity. It is interesting then that in ordinary language, the phrase "to make an example of someone" has 2 meanings. The first is to uphold something as exemplary. The second is to annihilate it as exemplary. The exercise of law, too, depends on analogous concepts. Justice is reduced to mere brute force if it exists outside of a framework of time, proceeding case by case, particular by particular, without any underlying concept. This is because in a common law framework, the law needs to be based on historical precedent that reaches into and affects the future. So there's no such thing as a sort of singular case if each case and precedent sets precedent for future ones. So justice, by definition, is not only the capacity to rule on specific cases, but to correlate specific cases under general principles, or through precedent across time. Enlightenment thinkers gave a lot of consideration to this and used similar arguments to consider the basis of law. The subsumption of particulars into general concepts is key to Immanuel Kant's critiques of reason and his critique of judgment, and I include here his moral philosophy. The categorical imperative emerges out of the necessity to correlate specific acts with general principles. But as Kant knew, the structure of synthesis only works when we presume that actors are behaving rationally and out of their own freedom. This is why Kant himself saw cases of the opposite as a threat. In the case of the madman, to quote Kant, the actions, for example, of a madman or a drunkard can be attributed to them, but not imputed to them. And in his Anthropology, Kant states that when assessing liability of a crime, the first thing that must be determined is whether or not the alleged criminal was mad at the time. The point here is not to stigmatize madness, although surely this has been an implication of this kind of reasoning, but to understand that many rules only hold under the presumption that individual actors are acting out of freedom and not out of compulsion. For example, it is reasonable to say that you cannot be executed for a crime that you have not done, but this presumes a capacity for you to act as you and not as someone else. The possibility of multiple or conflicted selves who act not out of freedom has always thrown a wrench in theorizing human action and its implications. In fact, as Kant argued, a society has no legal basis in justice if it is presumed that players are not acting rationally. And this is why this 2018 case proposes such a legal predicament today. Another option is to consider that it is the state itself which is unjust. This would be a structure that necessitates civil disobedience. Philosopher John Rawls used social contract and game theory to define justice as a fair game. But what happens when the game itself isn't fair? What happens when the players aren't themselves to begin with? Or what happens when the game itself is rigged? If, like me, you live in Germany, in which capital punishment is outlawed, you may posit the situation here in America is not just in the first place. So there is the corollary to a subject acting irrationally, the possibility that the law itself is not justified, but is simply the capricious wielding of power. It is the state, not the legal subject, who is actually the sick body. So if you were to live in Nazi Germany, for instance, then it would be clear that the law has no basis in justice. In the philosopher Gillian Rose's neo-Hegelian view, ethics has no legal basis in law due to a situation of what she calls diremption, or brokenness, a sense of separation between law and the just state. For Rose, this diremption lies in the understanding that the Enlightenment project led to the violence of the Holocaust, among others. Adrian Piper, unlike Rose, is committed to the Enlightenment and is committed in arguing why Kant's understanding of reason is the antidote to, not the cause of injustice. She's interested in constructing frameworks of collective action that both theorize and reinforce the social contract. One question becomes, can we behave rationally, and what does this depend on? Or to paraphrase Piper, can we ever act in a way that is not selfish? Piper has recently said in an interview that among her greatest achievements is having successfully escaped the US alive. The artist does not choose words lightly and has devoted her recent work to an articulation of her survival, her book Escape to Berlin. Piper saw her life as endangered, and the reason she's not here today in this room stems directly from this fact. Surely we can account for the sense of endangerment and peril with the violation or suspension of the law, but on what grounds? It's crucial to understand that Piper's escape to Berlin, as she's called it, has its roots not only in personal violation, but what she sees as a general violation of the social contract. The social fabric in the U.S. is such as not to only endanger her life in particular, but all life. The source of this injustice is not the incorrect exercise of the existing legal framework, but something more pernicious, a corroded social fabric and a regression into an egoistic rationality. In this unjust state, the assault on bare life would not be the power exercised by the state alone, but a kind of unjust power stemming from the social body itself. This is the harrowing condition of interpersonal antagonism that Piper's artworks have often asked us to consider or experience. For instance, in the mythic being works or the catalysis works, or in her direct framing of racially grounded prejudice in a work such as Four Intruders Plus Alarm Systems from 1980. Piper's work, The Probable Trust Registry, is an attempt to evaluate the conditions in which a social contract is possible. The participatory group performance, then, has implications for other forms of game-like collective activity. One is the democratic process, which can also be described as a participatory group performance based on a presumption of trust. Piper's work implies a registry of so-called probable trust. Visitors are invited to voluntarily sign contracts committing themselves to any of three statements, reading, "I will always mean what I say, I will always be too expensive to buy, and I will always do what I say I'm going to do." After signing one, they receive a paper printout confirming their admission to the Probable Trust Registry, a database of signatories that will be held securely for a century. A copy of this list is ultimately also released exclusively to the participants. Piper herself spells out the rules over 12 performance instructions. By signing the contract or by not signing the contract, you are forced to consider your future actions along three ethical guidelines: reliability in deed, honesty, and something we can interpret as either dignity or incorruptibility, the inability to be coerced or bought through bribery or corruption, as well as the notion that human life is irreducible to economic exchange. If this were a piece of philosophy, it would be necessary for Piper herself to pin down what she means by these statements. But in a work of performance art, the question is thus thrust on the participants, who have no choice but to act, since even non-participation in this setting is a form of action. One way we can analyze Piper's work, then, is as a game theoretical experiment. Game theoretical because it involves the setup of rational actors with individual choices and collective outcomes. The game theoretical analysis and its relationship to legal thinking is suggested by the work's subtitle, The Rules of the Game. We can take another hint from John Rawls, Piper's teacher, who gave as she calls it, quote, game theoretical analysis of Hobbes' social contract theory. Much of Piper's philosophical writing has been an attempt to formulate a transpersonal ethics, as we've learned, derived from social contract theory and Kant's metaphysics, and in opposition to Hume's conception of the individualistic self. Social contract theory is described by Piper as a bargain in which a group of people decide to trade personal freedom for, quote, the peace and stability attendant on abiding by certain rules held in common. A hypothetical narrative in which self-interestedly rational agents come to agreement. These rules, then, are held together by consensus and are easily corroded. If we consider social contract theory game theoretically, as Rawls has done in his theory of justice, then we can construct several scenarios in which participants are disincentivized or unable to uphold the social contract. One such scenario that Piper has analyzed at length is that of moral egotism. For Kant himself, there's an ethical similarity between madness and moral egotism. He writes of, quote, the logical egoist who considers it unnecessary to test his judgment also by the understanding of others. So similar to the madman, as a hypothetical example, whose reality is not shared by the laws of others' reality. Another antagonist to the social contract relates to something that's been mentioned in an earlier presentation, which is the free rider problem, which is the subject of a philosophical paper by Piper. The free rider problem can be summed up as the personal incentive to benefit from collective action without the effects of non-participating in that action. A free rider is someone who benefits from the outcomes of the social contract while not contributing to it. For instance, We all agree that voting is important for a democracy to function. Democracy only works if we all vote, yet I can equally argue, legitimately, out of a framework of moral egoism, that my individual vote makes no difference so long as others are voting, since my own vote will never tip the scales. So based on my personal interest alone, how can voting be rationalized? It is only out of a general obligation as a rule or law that I can be impelled to do so. This is one way in which we can frame the tensions between the social contract and form of moral egoism that Piper has explored in her philosophical work. Thomas Hobbes's moral skeptic, the fool, is a character who argues that the social contract can be exchanged for personal gain and feels it is acceptable to break covenants so long as others keep them. In a paper, Piper identifies in Kant a solution to the free rider problem. Kant was especially concerned to distinguish rational critique from polemic used for personal gain. Piper argues that Kant frames polemicists as an instance of free riders, and that they appear to argue about the nature of God, justice, etc., but in fact represent instrumentalists squabbling geared only to win. The figure of the polemicist was such a problem for Kant that he accuses them of dishonesty, baseness, dissimulation, and personal vanity. I think we can understand what Kant means here in distinguishing polemic from critique. There is a difference between intellectual debate constructed on mutual respect, which moves knowledge forward, and mere argument based on false principles only geared to win, marked by, quote, underhanded and deceitful tactics, which end up nowhere. Piper finds in Kant's argument the notion that the polemicist free rider is not acting out of rational freedom, but is in effect facing a sort of self-deception. They're bluffing themselves. They represent not rational agents, but actors who are in fact split selves and mired in self-deception. Perhaps no contemporary figure represents the simultaneous, polemical, and split selfhood more than the figure of the troll, a category of performative polemic that exploits the good faith activity of others. So we arrive at the same problem. Certain rules function only when we can assume that actors do not break or uphold them. Not only this, but that they act with rational freedom, and not with the multiple or split subjectivity of a troll, a polemicist, or a free rider. For Kant, each of these conditions represents a return to the state of nature, since reason, quote, can only validate and secure its claims through war, a condition of generalized enmity, distrust, and retaliation. Seeing how quickly a corrosion of the social contract leads to a natural state of war, we can begin to understand some of Piper's statements that her life itself was in danger, when you presume that the social contract in general has been corroded. The antidote, says Piper of Kant, is the critique of reason itself, based on the universal groundwork for rulemaking, not personal agendas. In several places in her writing, Piper identifies the basis of the social contract as the condition of reliability in which words can be trusted. Following Kant, promise-keeping emerges as the perfect duty. It is through the social contract of the promise that society can be reinforced. As Piper writes, quote, if breaking our promises has the foundationally destructive social role Kant has claimed, then keeping them one promise at a time would at least reverse the trend. Piper's Probable Trust Registry is a social game all about promises. The work has implications within the larger social games of democracy and justice, and asks us to ask questions about our motivations, choices, and freedoms to act or not act. It does this not by arriving at any single result, but by asking us to reasonably consider our actions as we choose to make promises or choose not to. Effectively, what we are considering is the role of freedom in making these considerations. The group performance is not physical, but fundamentally cognitive. It requires us to consider how we can act not out of self-deception or self-interest, by asking us to make a promise to ourselves. An authoritarian injunction to participate is a requirement, in contrast, would effectively repeat the problem of split or mixed agency that throws a wrench in the social contract, as we saw. So in allowing us to choose, the work is fundamentally inclusive, so long as we choose to make the good faith assumption that it means something. It also leaves the option for us open to be like free riders and to not participate, For instance, if we interpret the proposition itself with contempt. Consider the case in which we decide that Adrian Piper is simply trolling us and the work is fundamentally absurd and meaningless. The work immediately ceases to have practical, theoretical, and artistic effect. Or consider the case in which Piper forces participants to sign. The promises that take the form of written contracts to oneself then fall apart. What it requires then is a form of participation in the face of a commitment simply to act freely. Since the piece was conceived, it has been shown in the U.S., in Italy, and in Germany. During this time, questions about the state of democracy have emerged in the wake of the vote for Trump and Brexit, or recently the Supreme Court nomination in the U.S. Seen socio-historically, Piper's recent work has been remarkably prescient in aligning games of trust, rules, and collective agency. Another parallel structure that the work itself invites for consideration is the structure of voting, of course. What was revealed by the Brexit vote and the Trump vote was not voters' populist and isolationist or racist natural inclinations, but the extent to which the social contract has been betrayed by a disbelief that the vote even mattered, aside from enabling individualist gain. In fact, Kant's figure of the polemicist made a return, although it appeared to take a democratic setting. The folly of calling a referendum to gauge the will of the people in the case of Brexit was to reveal voters' isolation from the democratic process altogether. The will of the people emerged as brutally contradictory. One of the most radical propositions from Piper's work is how it points out a necessary link between agency and the imagination of a future. If we lack a future in which to imagine the real effects of our decisions, then promises have no sensible basis, since promises are inherently future-oriented. If our promises have no sensible basis, then we become free riders or polemicists. And if we are free riders or polemicists, then we descend quickly into a state of natural war, as Piper argues from Kant. So what the work asks is whether the social fabric has led to the inability of people to act as rational agents if they cannot visualize a future. It also offers a proposition for its repair. If we concede that we've descended to a state of polemic equivalent to mistrust, then the necessity of Piper's project and her intuition of its root causes is vindicated both practically and theoretically in its reparative function of exploring the transcendental possibility of interpersonal trust. Thank you. I think we have time for a couple of questions, so I think the other panelists will join me up on stage. Hi, does anyone have any questions for?
There's a question up there, I think.
First of all, thank you for your incredibly lucid consideration of Piper and also of Kant, from the specialists and the non-specialists alike. I'm curious about what happens if we take Kant seriously. I feel like if we don't do so, then we're bluffing, to use a third person who spoke comment. Kant wrote mostly about anthropology, and when he talked about rationality and reason, he was not talking about me. Now, what he said was the man's skin was dark, and of course that's an example of why he's quite stupid. Now that's how I feel when I encounter people in the liberal West Side, UCLA, academic, non-academic arena. They look at me and presume, oh, that guy will just make sure your purse is closed, you know. So if we take Kant seriously, and he is not talking about people like me, I do not have rationality. I don't understand how then, I'm curious about what taking his anthropological writings seriously means, how it affects this larger project of thinking about freedom and free action and free thought. Because well, that's actually my question. If you take Kant's anthropological writing seriously, in the ways in which he spoke about race, he did not believe that people like me had rationality. Then how do you make the jump to much of the rest of the connections you're making, that Piper is making about Immanuel Kant? That's my question.
I guess I'll, I'll attempt that question. So, I mean, I should preface this by saying I'm not a Kant specialist. So I felt it was important to bring Piper's involvement with Kant into our thinking about her art, because it is such a big part of her opus, and that's why I went to speak to that. So, but I cannot comment on the exegetical issues of interpreting Kant with authority. But nevertheless, I think that the question that you raise is incredibly important, and I briefly touched on that when I said, well, it is kind of prima facie surprising that Piper, who has addressed issues of racism, especially in the American context, so convincingly, is nevertheless drawn to Kant. Both because, as you rightly point out, in his writings on geography and anthropology and so on, he makes all of these blatantly racist remarks, and because we have since then become suspicious of the Enlightenment project as a whole because of all the injustice and all the slavery and all the horrible things that it has perpetrated. So I think it's, I don't want to sort of stand up and kind of defend going back to Kant. I think that which authors and which tools from history one decides to use for their emancipatory project is something that only that person can really comment on and decide. So I would really, in that case, maybe refer you to Piper's own writing on xenophobia, and where she discusses her uses of Kant. I think I cannot offer you a satisfactory answer, but I think it's really important to acknowledge this as a live problem. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
Is it on? I think it's very important what you say, because when it was always the part which was the most difficult for me to understand, mainly in being in Europe or in France, for example, where you have, we were speaking about it like the other day, and that Kant was, I never understood how she was able to refer to Kant to face racism. And so for the reader, for the text for the reader, I tried to read Kant in another way. And then I was reading Kant through other philosophers, French philosophers like mainly Deleuze, and the book he wrote on Kant, and also Foucault or Derrida. And they helped me actually to understand Kant in a different way, which was also linked to political activism in France in the early 70s, and also the notion Derrida is raising with hospitality, which comes from Kant, and or cosmopolitanism also comes from Kant. So it was a way for me to get, I don't have the word in English, to try to feel better with the connection between Adrian Piper and Kant through these like readings I had. But it's true that it's very, it is a part which is, and I think you understand very good also this with food for the spirit. Food for the spirit is really something which is a physical experience of what this critique would mean, and that she is doing yoga, and that she is fasting, and that she's taking these photos of herself, getting like, that she tells in the narrative around that she was really trying to see exactly like that she's still alive, you know, that she's still alive, going through the experience of reading Kant. But she was very young then, so it's 71 she was 24, 24, 25? Yeah, 23, yeah. Mm.
There's a question on that too.
I would suggest, in reference to this discussion, I hope artfully, that the opposite of yes, we can is no, we can't.
Are you punning on Kant?
Yeah, I'm punning on Kant. And now we're living in a time dominated by the Republicans. We can't do anything, at least not for now, as a country, moving forward on any of the issues I suspect most of the people or all of the people in this room care about. So 30 days from today, get out and vote for anybody with a D after their name. And if anybody asks, just tell them Democrats vote on Tuesday and Republicans vote on Wednesday. It's a new format. It's much more efficiently.
On that call to vote, I think I'm going to bring us to a close and thank the audience for hanging in there for the long haul today. I want to really give a very, very warm and special thanks to all of the speakers, Bruce Altschuler, Donna Dennis, Jeffrey Deitch, Alex Albero, Nizan Shaked, Jörg Heiser, Elvan, Zabunyan, Vid Simoniti, and Pablo Larios. I think it was a fantastic range of papers and thinking on Adrian Piper's great work, so thank you. I will again just acknowledge MoMA and their collaboration on this event and the exhibition, of course, and thank Visionary Women, as well as my colleagues Erin Christovale and Vanessa Arizmendi and the great Claudia Bester for organizing our day. Again, to remind you all, November 3rd is the final panel of this group of discussions called Deconstructing the Truism of Race as a Social Construct. So please join us on the evening of November 3rd. And thank you all very much for the day.